We welcome you today for what has to our students become one of their favorite lectures. Um, I think it's a kind of a combination of a favorite lecture, while it's also one that some would say is not what you'd expect in a traditional personal finance class. Why would we be talking about America's financial future? I have to tell you, in a very strong way, and in a very positive way, we, I believe, in what I'll refer simply to as a faith-based society have what can become tendencies to think a lot about the end or what may happen in the next few years. And we, unfortunately, are very biased, not just in faith based societies, but as human beings, to messages that would persuade us to think that somehow fear and extreme and obvious negative messages have a greater impact on us than what they really should. And so it kind of helps to put things in perspective, not only from a pattern or from an organizational standpoint, but also you'll hear as we go through this lecture some very specific recommendations of things that I would do. I would look for if I were anticipating and trying to make good decisions based upon what the future may bring. It's not uncommon in most business profiles to recognize that those that can anticipate, those that can see, those that can actually have a vision of what may come in the future, actually are better prepared to make decisions that fit very nicely and fit very prosperously into what we'll perceive as the future. It's kind of fun. The gospel, even as we talk about in Mosiah chapter 8, talks about seers and what a seer is. A seer can anticipate, a seer can see. It says there that a seer is the greatest of all gifts. Why? Because if you can anticipate and you can see, then you can anticipate more wisely. I'll just say this. I think it's important to kind of understand. I hope that you take it in the right spirit when we try to suggest what it might mean to us who would anticipate or would feel what things might be whenever I get into any kind of a session about what the last days might bring. It's very common. I think if any one of you were to sit down right now and give me a list of the things that are the negative events, the things that will be catastrophic or things that will be very difficult for us to handle, there would be those who could come up with very long, lengthy lists of the things that will happen in the last days. I love to ask this question of people. Could you also give me a list of the good things that will be taking place during that period of time? Unfortunately, our lists are quite short in that regard. I would only encourage anyone to kind of reflect that, of course, is certainly part of our theology, reflect on what the current apostles and the current prophets are saying. And I think you'll be very surprised. We'll share some of those during our workshop today, but I think you'd be very surprised at some of the very positive things that are coming and some of the ways that we could, I hope, with that information, begin to develop a mindset or a motivational base or a thought process that actually accommodates what could become some fairly good things. So as we talk about America's financial future, we have a little fun with it with our graphics, talking about what kind of could be. And I want you to know, and I want you to reflect very positively today on the reality that we'll cover not only the things that are negative, but we'll also cover some things that are very compelling. We believe that as we traject ourselves or as we pattern ourselves or prepare ourselves for the future, we are much better aware of events as they take place, and we can capitalize on those. So there's no discussion of the future that ever really has perspective until you talk a little bit about the past. And so what I've done with our students at BYU is to talk quite regularly, quite and in depth about things that have taken place in the past, because it kind of helps you put in perspective. I'll give you an example here real quickly. These are things that took place prior to 1800, and some of them are kind of fun. The first personal check that was ever written. Here's the last time the federal government was out of debt. I love to ask people that because a lot of people are very concerned about the federal debt, as they well should be. And I asked them, when was the last time the federal government was completely out of debt? It was 1835. You'll know that in the next trivia session you ever have with your friends. But here's one I want to show you because this helps you to put things in perspective. Back in 1720, the London stock market lost 98.5% of its value. Can you imagine what that cataclysmic drop might do for us today? It lost 98% of its value, and it took 100 years to recover. Whew. When you look at that, obviously that would give anybody a heartache or a heart palpitation thinking about ever investing in a stock market. But we'll show you how indeed that can be overcome with what's happened in the American market over time. Wildcat banks, the financial panics, first income tax that was ever collected in America was back in 1861. Debtors' prisons. You remember, it used to be that if you went into debt and you couldn't pay off all your debts, you had to go to either had to send yourself or one of your slaves to debtor prison to serve out a sentence. We gave those debtor prisons up in 1869. First Dow Jones Industrial in 1884. These are things that took place during the 1900s. So not that long ago for some of us, but for some it was eons ago. Here's some kind of fascinating things that took place then. We had a Ponzi scheme. We're going to talk more about Ponzi schemes in our investment lecture, but Charles Ponzi back in 1921 was first convicted, and that's where the name Ponzi came from, was from the Ponzi scheme. The Black Thursday and the stock market collapse, the Great Depression of the 30s. Minimum wage in 1933, the minimum wage in America was just 33 cents an hour. Just unbelievable. Now let's talk about inflation. Everybody's very, very concerned about inflation. Look at this inflation back in Hungary in 1946. In 1 month, they had 42 quadrillion % interest in inflation. They, unfortunately, to try to fund things, they just printed too much money. And as the stories sometimes go, they take whole wheelbarrows full of money to just purchase a loaf of bread. Can you imagine living through those? It kind of, I hope, gives you a balance and kind of a perspective of where we are today. When things start to turn a little sour, we often have a very narrow focus, and we see things as cataclysmic, as maybe not recoverable. But kind of look at some of these things people have been through before, and it gives you a flavor or a sense that maybe with time and with the vastness of the resources we have and the vastness of the American economy and even the world economy, it's pretty surprising how well we can recover from some of these events. So here, at night, some of the students love this. In 1976, a CEO, that's the chief executive officer of a company, his pay was 36 times the average worker. 36 times, that seems like a lot until you see that by 2008, it had grown to 369 times the average worker. That's those discrepancies or disparities of income that we have today that can be pretty shocking. It was the misery index that Ronald Reagan brought up when he was running against Jimmy Carter for president of the United States. It talked about the misery index being 20.76%. It was a combination of interest rates and unemployment. We've surely never known a misery index that high since then. But then, gold prices, there's the great Trade Center bombing that took place on September 11th, 2001, the Great Recession that we experienced in 2008. And one of the things that could have been, potentially disastrous if indeed the repercussions were felt as they could have or potentially could have been, and that's in 2011, there was one of the rating agencies that actually downgraded federal debt. I don't agree with that. Whenever somebody can print money, it's pretty dang tough to not be able to pay back their debt. But indeed, one of the agencies felt like it was necessary to downgrade the United States debt. So when the federal government goes into debt, they obviously have a credit rating also, and so they, for some reason, felt like that was important to downgrade it. So here we are in 2017 on June the 12th, and we try to reflect, we try to understand, where do we go from here? And so let's just see, as we start this, there'll be lots of things that we cannot predict, we cannot understand, or we hope to get a better understanding of. But what are the things that we might say that we know will take place during the next century? And one of the things that I always, whenever I talk at BYU with my students, one of the first things that comes up is Armageddon, the second coming. That certainly could take place during this next 100 years. Most people kind of intuitively assume that the last days would suggest that might very likely happen. Well, we'll see. So here since 2000, there's been all these people that have predicted the second coming, predicted some kind of an Armageddon or last days of events. A couple of them kind of specifically revolved around Utah, the Mormon faith. In 2015, a gal named Julie Rowe predicted that it would come. That was the Mayan calendar. Hers was in 2016. It would come, and obviously it didn't come then. And then there was a Lloyd Cunningdale that they said that here in Salt Lake that had said that the Donner Party buried a time capsule, and in that time capsule they predicted it would be 2016. There's no shortage of opportunities to put some special date on your calendar as that day that you'll prepare for. As you do that, I want you to understand just very carefully or quite quickly what that might mean if indeed that date were to come soon. When I talk to my students in class, it's not been uncommon for someone to walk up afterwards and say, "Now, Brother Marsh, like, you're talking about setting up an IRA. We're in our 20s, and like that would not, you can't even pull money out of it till you're 59 and a half without out of penalty. Why, why would we do that if there is and they pause right there. They can't quite say, second coming because it's kind of hard for them to kind of have somebody know that they're even, interested in that. And I just say, we're going to talk more. We're going to take a lot more about it. But I'll just say this: there's a rule or a thought or a mindset that we've developed in all of our planning that I believe might serve your purposes well without any regard to any end game, and that is to always plan, to always prepare, to always dream, and to always build as if you're going to be here forever. This actually can become a tremendous experience. But we'll talk about it because there's a lot that I've got coming up that we'll discuss that. What else could happen during this century? Well, a lot of people would say certainly we're going to, each of us will die. Now, we talked a lot about this in our first lecture when we talked about more money than you'll ever need. So I don't want to get too much into it right now. You can go back and review that, but we reviewed what the deathclock.com, and the date that, it gave me was 2052, 99 years old I'd be. I talked about the mindset. They asked a question about whether you're, have an optimistic outlook, a kind of a normal outlook, or a pessimistic outlook, or a sadistic outlook, and the impact that can have. If I went back and typed in a normal outlook, it cut 25 years off my life. I just always like to emphasize that. I love everyone. Even if you need to turn off the recorder for a minute or turn off your computer for just a second and just ponder and reflect on what it might mean to have a little better attitude or take a little better approach to who it is or how we see the future. Because I think I can confidently give you a lot of very good reasons to at least explore the possibility of assuming something a little bit better. And then I went back and typed in pessimistic, and of course the sign popped up that said, "Hey, that time's already passed, so I hope you've had a good day." When I typed in sadistic, but I just wanted you to see, I thought it's kind of fun for you to know that I tell my students that my goal is to live to August the 2nd. That's my birthday. Just, you might want to mark that on your calendar and appropriately reflect that each year with some kind of an expression of your appreciation for all the things that you're learning here. I've, of course, recommended that all of my students do that, and it doesn't seem like many of them are following through on that, so perhaps you could be the first. So here's August 2nd, 2011. I want to live, and so I would be 147 years old. I'd be 147 years old in 2011, or 2100, excuse me, 2100. I think that's a noble goal. I think that's kind of not a noble goal as much as just a very realistic goal. Wait till we talk about the innovations that'll change this world the most, especially medical innovations that can change the nature of our longevity. Already our longevity is increasing quite significantly, but I'll just tell you this, there's a good chance that before long it could exponentially increase. Because there really are circumstances, there are people that predict that indeed things could grow very differently. There's a Time magazine article, and it was the cover magazine for Time magazine when it first appeared. But it said if you'll live till 2045, that's the year that man will become immortal. We won't die after that. Now, of course, I'm not trying to tell you that that's the thing I'd check off on your calendar, but I just want you to know that there really are some very significant things to suggest that the best thing you could possibly do when it comes to your eventual demise is not hasten it by being pessimistic, and actually begin to fulfill and become a fulfillment of all you'd ever imagine by taking a much longer term view of life. What other things could happen during this century? Surely Medicare right now is projected to run out of money before 2024. So if you have grown to depend on Medicare, then there might be some problems with that by then. Right now, at current rates, by 2036, Social Security trust funds will be exhausted. And so, if you're receiving some kind of a financial benefit from Social Security, then you might want to worry about, I guess you'd think that you might want to worry about that. I'll just say this. There's a lot of people who say, "Brother Marsh, could you just tell me, is there a chance that I'll still be collecting my Social Security check? With all the problems that the federal government has right now, is there a possibility that I might not get that?" I'll just tell you my answer to it. I'll tell you, if the United States government is still waving a flag, meaning that there's not been some palace coup and there's been some not overthrow of the government and there's a whole new regime that's in or something like that, which I certainly don't predict or project, if the United States government is still waving a flag, you're going to get your Social Security benefits. Recently in Greece, they tried to cut down their pension, their kind of their public pension plan. They tried to cut the benefits down by 1%. There was rioting in the street and burning of buildings. I will also tell you that I believe that there really truly are significant and not that terrible of steps that we could take to solve the Social Security crisis. The sad thing is, it's not a financial problem that we face, it's a political problem. And right now, we're having a very, very difficult time coming up with a political solution to solve that. So I hope it brings some kind of hope. That might be something that you just consider very carefully. If you've got a Social Security benefit that's being projected, there's a very good chance you'll collect that Social Security benefit. In fact, I would put that as highly probable that you'll be collecting the Social Security benefit. There's nothing to worry about. Now, you might say, but how are they going to come up with the money? It's kind of a fun thing to talk about. Of all the governing entities in the United States of America, so you said might have United States or Utah, California, Nevada, something like that, or a city like Salt Lake City, Provo, New York, Los Angeles, something like that. Of all the governing entities, there's only one of those entities that has something that we refer to as a printing press. And you might say, yeah, but if you print too much money, then there'll be inflation. Let's just stick with the topic for right now. How can an entity that has a printing press not be able to give you the kind of financial benefit that they promised or that they committed to giving you by participating or engaging in the Social Security system? I'll just tell you that with that printing press and with the strongest and the most dynamic and vibrant economy the world has ever known, and is projected to become even stronger, you'll see as we do our compelling examples of things that are taking place today, I think you'll agree with me. There's a very good chance that you'll be collecting that benefit, so there's no real need to worry about that. So let's get started. What I'm going to do is divide my topics into two different sections. We want to make for absolutely certain that we cover first those things that we should be concerned about. There are 13 things that I want to kind of look at for you and just say, as we look forward, we try to project forward in America's future, there are things that you really should be concerned about. So as we try to understand those challenging trends or those things that might take place or the direction that will go, we have to assume that there will indeed be, there are tremendous challenges. There are tremendous challenges that we have to face. On the other hand, there are some really, really compelling trends that I think you'll be very fascinated to know about. So it's your choice, and you can decide for yourself which path you'll take as it relates to the way you'll plan, the way you'll project, and the way that you'll prepare. I think it might be very helpful. So let's start off with the 13 challenging trends. I don't spend a lot of time talking about them, and the biggest single reason is this. You can turn on the cable news networks on any of the channels, on MSNBC, on Fox News, on CNN, on any of those that give news on an ongoing basis, and within 2 hours, you'll have heard about every single one of these trends in detail. Why? Because we found that the only news that people will watch and listen to is news that is fearful, that is extreme, or that actually promotes something that causes the mind to be frightened. It's very fascinating. Those who've done research would suggest that 80 to 85% of all the reports that you'll get on those channels has something to do that is fearful or that is extreme or is that it is exaggerated. Why? Because when someone tries to set up a cable news network or any kind of a news network that actually gives positive messages, we found that over time people respond very positively when they're first out there because you think in your mind you really want to hear the good news. The sad thing is they never last. People just don't get very excited about them. So I'll quickly point out what they are, not take a lot of time going through the challenging trends, and just invite you to any one of those cable news networks. You can jump on at any point in time and listen in any way you'd like to a continuation or a more pronounced understanding of each of these themes. The first thing I'd like to talk about is just obviously a challenging thing that took place was that Great Recession that we went through back in 2008. It was frightening. I want you to know during the Great Depression, it lasted approximately 10 years. The unemployment reached as much as 25%. The Great Recession, some people don't believe we're through it yet. I would suggest that we are, but some people don't even believe that we're through it yet. There were many who at the bottom of that recession just said this: there's a new norm of endless recession. That's pretty interesting. A new norm of endless recession. Certainly the results since then have not borne that out, But you can see, and these were national commentators of some significance. They just said, you have to understand something. The market's probably not going to go up very much. We're probably going to go through an extended period of recession. There had been examples where other countries, look at Japan. Back in the 1990s, the Japanese stock market crashed, and it's never really regained the complete value that it had prior to that time. And it did kind of stay down flat for a long time. That's why a lot of people started talking about it, kind of a new norm of endless recessions. Fortunately, the stock market has not only recovered, but picked up a great deal since then. So I would suggest that it's probably not quite as bad as what they had suggested. But certainly, anytime you go through something as challenging as that kind of a reversal, sadly, I say this: I think most people have short memories. If you were alive and you were engaged and mature enough back in 2008 to remember how frightening that was, when massive companies were going bankrupt overnight, when the entire system was kind of thrown into an upheaval. And there were those who really sincerely believed that that was the financial Armageddon. That was the turning point. That was the settling spot that we'd probably never recover from. Just it kind of helps. Just like that stock market in London went down by 98.5%. I showed you how they recovered. Isn't it kind of fun? It should be kind of fun a little bit by now to just think that we've kind of recovered quite well, I think, since then. Sadly, there's a lot of people who just feel like, oh, it's only because we've spent a lot of money, we've done a lot of phony things. But I think those are mainly those that would involve us in conspiracy type theories. And all I know is that right now it seems as if the economy is improving on a relatively gradual slope, not as fast as some would like to see it perform. But the stock market obviously has done very well since that point in time. Real estate values. That was a frightening thing. I want you to know that during the Great Depression, real estate values went down by 25%. During the Great Recession, that's what we came to call this institutionally. We kind of called it the Great Recession in 2008. Real estate values went down by as much as 34%. There was a man who won the Nobel Prize just a few years ago for asset valuation. At the bottom of that market, he actually said this: a 20 to 25% decline in home prices would not surprise me at all. That's when they'd already dropped by 34%. He thought that they could go down by another 10 to 25%. Whew. There were those like Time Magazine that said, rethinking home ownership, why would you ever want to own a home? In that kind of an environment, they just felt like things would stay flat, they'd stay down. There was no significant reason to own a home. I will just tell you that most home values, now not all, but most home markets in America today have either recaptured the value that they had prior to 2008. Some have even gone a little bit higher. Now, the stock market as an investment has performed better since the bottom of 2008. But I want you to reflect and just remember, boy, we thought real estate was in a mess. There were a lot of people with their mortgages. Look at how many people, their mortgages were actually, the value of their home was worth less than their mortgage. They were underwater. Over 27% of all mortgages in America, almost a third of all people had a mortgage that the balance on the mortgage was worth more than the value on the house. That was a very scary experience. But it's actually worked its way through quite well, and we find ourselves now back at the point where there's a lot of economists who are saying maybe we're headed for another bubble. Won't predict that for right now, but I'll just tell you this, at least at the time it was a very frightening thing. It seems to have since then improved enough that we can kind of take a deep breath and say, well, it does seem like that had a tendency to do quite well. Here's something that's not improved well: healthcare costs in America. The Affordable Care Act was projected by those who created or enacted that legislation that it would significantly decrease healthcare costs. I think the President of the United States at the time predicted that the average family would be spending $2,500 less per year in healthcare costs. Obviously, that's blown off the chart. This is one that truly still remains as a very significant problem in this country. I'd give you some of these numbers and statistics, but it's probably nothing more than needs to be said than just healthcare costs are very frightening, and it's something that there's got to be some kind of an answer found to it before long, or obviously things could turn quite wrong for us. Let me just say this: if healthcare costs are bad, if they're ones that really have become something that we're so deeply concerned about, let me tell you something else that's actually the inflation rate has even gone up more than healthcare costs, and that's public education, specifically higher education. boy, what's happening in public education in our country? Just just kind of just simply reflect for a second. Here's out of 30 comparable countries throughout the world, the United States, here's the United States ranking. When it comes to math, we're 25th. 25th in overall performance. Science, 21st. Graduation rates, number 20. But look at where we are in spending per student, number 1. We spend more per student per capita than anybody else in the world, and we get those kind of results. Something's up. Look at this crisis in education and higher education. Pew Research did some research and asked 1,000 college and university presidents. These are just not man on the street type conversations. These are people that actually preside over colleges and universities. And they said this, 33% of them said that higher education is going in the wrong direction, and 50% of them said that we will lose our global lead in the next decade. Unbelievable. And I don't know if you can see this on the screen or not. There's medical care costs. That red line right there, that's medical care costs. That blue line right there represents college tuition and fees. It's also completely out of control. But I have to add, when we talk about the compelling trends, when we talk about the innovations that will change this world the most, there is some good news. There's one more good piece of news that I want to share for all of those that know anything about the Brigham Young University. Actually, each year it is rated very well when it comes to managing and controlling costs. In 2016, of the 5 least expensive private universities, BYU Provo was number 1. Their tuition, their annual tuition was $5,300. Remarkable, especially when you consider that number 2 on the list as a private university was what they call the Rust College, and theirs was $9,500, nearly twice as much as what's charged at BYU. So it obviously is a very good, a very excellent quality when it comes to an excellent value when it comes to the education. There's also been something announced by the church, and we'll talk about it when we come to the compelling trends, but that's this pathways of education that will make it so people throughout the world can receive very high quality education at a very reasonable price. And there's a lot of things taking place in education today, especially higher education, and we'll talk about them once we get there. You'll see what I mean by I really do believe we've got some excellent opportunities on the horizon to change the nature of the way or the direction that higher education is going in our country. Next thing we'll talk about is energy dependence. Think about it. Energy, energy, energy. We, with our students, at the bottom of the recession, I remember back in 2008, when things were very bad, gas prices were as high as they were, and it seemed like as out of control as they were. We quoted all these presidents who, during their administration, Richard Nixon right through Bill Clinton, who predicted that our dependence on foreign oil would finally go away. They actually gave dates that it would go away. Instead of going away, look at this chart. That's how much oil we import, so bring in from other countries. This is how much we export. You can see by even 2010, there was a very significant difference in the imports and the exports. I'm going to kind of tease you a little bit. When we get to the compelling trends, we're going to show you how actually there are those who believe that within the next 3 to 4 years, we will turn that and we'll actually export more oil than we import. When you know how critical energy is to the entire world, to know how important it is to not be relying on your energy from countries that hate you and would do anything they can to see you gone, it's kind of helpful to know that we don't have to get involved. We don't have to have those kind of things taking place as it relates to the energy that we consume. Let's start dealing with this now on what might to most people be a little bit more personal level when it comes to finance and how it impacts you in the future. When I first started teaching at church education system, CES, that's what they do for seminary and institute teachers, they just described to you that whenever someone retires, they would always tell them that there's a stool that will be dependent, that they'll rely on for their retirement. And there's 3 legs of that stool. What are those legs? You probably can get them yourself quite easily. You're going to be receiving some Social Security income. That's one leg of the stool. At the church, they had a master retirement plan that made it so that was obviously a leg of the stool that said a company, this is what we call a pension benefit at a company, says if you work for us for a certain period of time, we'll pay you X amount of money each month for the rest of your life. The third, of course, was income that they could pull or distributions that they could pull out of any 401k money that they acquired by that time, by the time they retired. We've got some others that we'll show you later, but for right now, just know how are those retirement options performing in America today? Sadly, pension plans in 1980, 82% of all Fortune 500 companies provided pension plans for their employees. By 2011, that had gone down to 17%, and current estimates are that they're about 13%. Most companies have abandoned pension plans because they're simply too risky for companies to continue to provide. Social Security benefits, I won't get into great depth because I don't think it's critical, but it used to be that the benefits that you received from Social Security were projected based upon your lifetime to exceed the contributions that you'd made to the plan. We crossed that plateau back on August of 2012. Now the benefits that you'll receive are projected to be less based upon life expectancies, although they don't know anything about life expectancies as you and I know them after taking this class. They say based on life expectancies, you'll actually receive less than the contributions that you put into the plan. 401k contributions, how are we doing with those? As a percentage of income, they've never been lower among Americans today. There's, for some reason, people are either discouraged, they're seeking faster options. Whatever it is, we'll talk a lot more about when we talk about our investments. But for right now, those benefits that people in the past depended so critically on are benefits that are now just not being made available to them because they're either not doing what they should do with them, or companies are cutting back significantly on the kind of benefits that they're providing. The federal government, long time ago, back in the Depression, started what we'll refer to as entitlement programs, where they just said this: there's just certain things that an individual who's contributed to the Social Security system in our country or whatever, they should have the right to have certain benefits paid to them, especially during their retirement. I won't get into it much, but just see if you can catch this concept. A lot of times you'll hear them talk about how the federal government is currently about $20 trillion in debt. It's real close. It should come probably this year. The federal government will actually reach the point where they're $20 trillion in debt. But that's debt that has already been incurred. We've actually obligated, they've incurred that debt. They've actually signed the documents and made it so that someone has loaned them money and made it so that they could fund whatever benefits were necessary or whatever government programs were necessary in that time. Now let's talk about what we call unfunded liabilities. So that's a funded, that's things that we've already incurred that debt. Let's talk about unfunded liabilities. What this does is this: it takes all those entitlement programs and it says, based on the expenses that we believe that we'll be incurring in the future, how many of those benefits are not currently accounted for when we project with our taxes and any other kind of revenue for the federal government? What other debt will we have to incur in the future to pay for those services? Remember, federal deficit as we know it today already incurred the debt. Unfunded liabilities, this is additional debt that will have to be incurred unless we find additional tax revenues or other kind of revenues. Look, Social Security has another $16 trillion, prescription drug benefits, another $22 trillion, Medicare, another $27 trillion. The total unfunded liabilities in America today are $106 trillion. So add to the already incurred debt of $20 trillion, $106 trillion, and you come up with a pretty spectacular number. But the way it brings it home to us most personally is by me just telling you this: if this continues on and we do not find any other way to fund those sources, it is projected that actually the liability that's being incurred, that will have to be incurred per taxpayer for these unfunded liabilities, is $885,000 per taxpayer. Now that seems like a pretty difficult, and I'm not trying to minimize the impact that could have if these programs, if there's not some resolution for them. We know right now we certainly don't have a political solution for them because no one's willing to deal with them. Somehow we hope that we'll find some kind of a financial solution, but that's one that when we talk about the things that are truly challenging trends in this country, that's one that we have to talk about with some enthusiasm, and there is no obvious solution for it. Our federal budget, now remember, these are the things where we've already incurred the debt. So the federal budget deficit, and I could go into this, but there's not any time that's necessary on most anyone's part to know just how devastating it is to have currently a federal debt nearing $20 trillion. And if we took that and divided it by the income that we have in America, so income each year. Now, let me explain that just a little bit. When you go to the bank and you want to borrow money, what's the most important thing you can show the banker? That you make income, because the banker wants to make sure that with the income that you're generating each year, you can make your payments. What is America's income? Some people have referred to America's income as being our gross domestic product. The gross domestic product of the United States government is the sum total of all goods and services that are produced each year in America. So, of all the goods and all the services that we produce, what are they worth? Just this year, that amount was $17 trillion. Can you see how our debt is higher than our ongoing income? That's not good. And so that's once again, that's a place that I'm going to suggest that is a challenging trend, and it's very real, and we've got to do something about it. And we've talked very enthusiastically about how life expectancies are going to increase. In fact, sometimes exponentially. Well, actually, as those life expectancies increase, what also goes with that is something that we refer to as aging parents. Many of you have had a situation where you've cared for an aging parent. I'll just tell you the statistics, the numbers of what takes place. Strongly convinced they'll retire in comfort. Only 11% of all people in America are strongly convinced they'll retire in comfort. Have a parent that they are currently providing. Look at this. Of all Americans, adult Americans today, 41% of them have a living parent that they're providing some kind of a care for. I'm not going to go through every single one of these. Boy, there's some. It's projected based upon the kind of care that you'd have to give to a parent that it could end up costing you over $659,000 out of your own personal resources in order to provide that care on a long-term basis. Here's the one that I find great hope in. So this is a problem. There's no doubt this is a problem. And we've got to solve it in some kind of a realistic way. It is a definite threat to our economy to have that kind of expense that's being incurred on an ongoing basis. Here's one that I find great hope in. When they ask those that are providing that care, is it a great responsibility to you? What kind of a burden has that placed on you? 89% of all people that respond to that survey will say the responsibility is only a minor or no sacrifice at all. I like that. I think that's a kind of an important reflection on the values that Americans have today when it comes to caring for those parents. I believe that we're doing a pretty dang good job of it. But it is a burden, and it's something that we need to be very careful with. Now, something that's also very closely related to having parents that get old and need to have extra care is the fact that in our economy today, for whatever reason, it's much more common for people to say that they will not retire at age 65. Now, think about that. So if you're a young person, so when I'm teaching my students at BYU, I have to say, look, you're going to go out there and compete for jobs. But actually, they're starting to compete with jobs a lot more with people that just do not want to retire. When we asked people in 1980, will you retire? Will you work past the age of 65? Only 14% of them said that they'd work past age 65. In 2010, you asked that exact same question, 75% said they'll work past age 65. I saw some research yesterday that said that number's gone up. That number's now gone up to 83% of all people project that they'll work past age 65. Now, you for yourself can ask, why would they be doing that? It might be because they're so healthy. We're much more healthy when we turn 65 today, so we might want to work a little longer. It might be that there is some noble and wonderful thing that we'd like to accomplish beyond age 65. It might, unfortunately, be that a lot of individuals do not feel like they have the financial security to retire at age 65. Not only do they have the benefit, do they not have the assets that are necessary, their fear. Fear is also an overwhelming burden that says, I just have to keep working in order to make ends meet. We hope to reverse some of that when it comes to our discussion. But think of the pressure that places on our workforce to know that so many people will continue to work, even though it might not be something that they would normally project or anticipate. They'll just continue to work. Fortunately, I do work at a job where I once asked my supervisor at BYU how long, if there's some kind of an age out for me, and he said that he thinks that I can teach as long as I'd like to. Indeed, this is my greatest joy, and so I would like that to be the case. Our debt levels, we're not going to continue to go. I want, the federal government is all, is terribly in debt. See, that's just so close to $20 trillion. I actually checked that on June 12, 2017, just today, and look at that. It's almost $20 trillion. But look at our mortgage debt, almost $15 trillion. Look at our personal debt, almost 18 trillion. Our business and municipal debt, almost 13 trillion. The total United States national debt currently stands at $67 trillion. Never higher. All those are record levels in each of those categories. And you know what comes next. It's just growing exponentially. Somehow people have just not got the idea or the feeling or the sense that debt can be quite cumbersome, quite burdensome, and can be a great threat to our eventual security if we don't find some way to temper it in reasonable ways. We always know this, that taxes, well, that there's a great threat that taxes will increase in our country. That's definitely a challenging trend. I'm going to talk about, on our compelling trend, something that I think you'll find a little helpful when it comes to taxes. But I'd also like to suggest that there's a number of different ways that taxes can indeed pay for or make sure that our obligations are cared for without there being the kinds of tax increases that a lot of people project or believe may be necessary. Our last one that we're going to talk about, 13 challenging trends, has to do with our adult children. In the book that I recommend for my students here at BYU, it's called The Millionaire Next Door. And in The Millionaire Next Door, they've devoted a whole chapter of the book to something called economic outpatient care. And that entire chapter is about individuals who are currently providing some kind of payments to adult children. And I'll just tell you this, they even specify in the book, they're not talking about education. When most of those that are interviewed for that book will say that they will help with the child's education. Sadly, there's a lot of situations where individuals have incurred long-term obligations by committing themselves to helping adult children even past education. Whenever I've come, I cannot tell you how many people I've had here in my office who, in tears, reflect on what's going on to them personally, and what it all, in many instances, comes back down to is some kind of a commitment, some kind of an obligation, or an obligation that they believe that they've incurred with their children to provide them some kind of a benefit on a long-term basis, and they're not able to provide those resources as easily as they one time thought that they could or that they should. And it turns into a real holocaust. I'm going to tell you something that's important right now. First of all, I'll put up their adult children so you can see it. I want to tell you something I find very fascinating. How many of you have known someone who said, you may have said this yourself, as a child is growing up, maybe in high school, you'll say something like, if you'll get good grades, I'll pay for your college. And that's a good and noble thing. What happens once that child finally gets to college and they've actually got the good grades, but the parents' financial situation is not what they anticipated it should be, and the burden of paying those expenses for their children is much greater than they had anticipated? Are they still obligated to make those payments? I'm going to give you a very interesting statistic I think you'll appreciate. When I ask my students, so I teach two classes at BYU. I teach the faculty and staff class, the older, for the older people, and I teach that I don't know, all of my faculty and staff would like to be known as the older people, but older only relative to my student class, where they're just going through and they're in their early 20s. So if I ask my faculty and staff class that question, I say, okay, you made that commitment. You said you'd pay for it if they got good grades, but now your financial situation makes it so that it's a real stress. In fact, it creates pressures that could be very negative for you. Are you still obligated to pay for that? I want you to know that 85% of all individuals that take my class, when I've taken this little research, 85% of them say, yes, you're still obligated. I hope that it would bring you some comfort to know this. I've asked my student class that same thing. I've tried to not reflect in any way some kind of a bias, as I simply say, your parents said that they'd pay for your college education, and if you got good grades, you get good grades, you're here at the Brigham Young University, and now it's a real pressure and creating a hardship for your parents to continue to make those payments. Are they still obligated? Only 15% of the students say they're still obligated. It's fascinating to find out where that sense of obligation is coming from. It behooves everyone to kind of reconsider. I'll just give you a real quick tip. With all of my sons, I said this. I am one. I'm just going to tell you, I love to help my children with their higher education. And so I just said, I just said it a little different way. I said, it's your mother's and I objective to pay or to contribute significantly to your higher education. And we would like to do that. And if when the time comes, we can actually do what we committed to do, then we will make those payments. But I said, I want you to always have a plan B, because I want to have the right at that time to say, it doesn't seem like financially I'm as able to make those payments as I thought I was, so I have to have you rely on Plan B. And we all know what Plan B is. We find that 62% of all students at the Brigham Young University today are receiving no support from parents whatsoever as it comes to their college education. They're figuring out a way to do it without that help. That's Plan B. Plan B is the parents' help is not what it was anticipated to be. Therefore, you just need to do what 62% of all the students there at BYU are doing. And I think it's helped. I think it gives my sons. I have 5 sons. I think it gives them perspective too on the enthusiasm I have for their schooling, but the objectivity I have to know that there always has to be a Plan B to make sure something like that works efficiently. So I hope that you have that same thing. I didn't really go through that, and maybe I'll put that back up. The obligations that we're incurring for our adult children back in 1980, 61% of all young people were receiving some kind of assistance from their parents. By 2012, that had grown to 80%. And I saw some recent projections that said that 85%. I just get that statistic. 85% of all adult children in America today still receive some kind of ongoing assistance from their parents. That's just staggering. I hope that somehow we can all work on ways to begin to reverse that trend. Speaking about trends, what I'd like to do then is make this gigantic shift. All we've done so far is to talk about the very challenging trends that are taking place in the country, things that you've heard of before, things that you've become very aware of based upon all the voices that will regularly make certain that you are very aware of what those challenges are. Now let's see if we can build a pattern. Let's see if we can build a picture. Let's see if we can recreate an America that we believe actually has hope, actually has vision. I'd like you, as you hear each one of these trends, to just ask yourself simply this question: who has actually communicated any of this information to you? Have you heard it? Have you seen it? Have you recognized? Have you had anybody? Because I'll tell you this, as we've gone through this class, many people will stop me and say, Brother Marsh, I just don't get it. I don't know where all these messages are coming from, because I've never heard these things. I once had a couple work for the State Department that came to Education Week, where we talked about some of the things that were taking place. And we did this lecture, and then right after it, we did one that's called the World-Class Prosperity that we'll talk a little bit about with this. This individual, when we came to the end of the class, just said this. He stood up right after, just when it was coming time to quit. And he said, look, he stood up, sitting right in the front row with his wife. He stood up. He said, look, I just got to say something. He said, we just flew in here yesterday, and the first class we attended this morning was on the Second Coming and all the events and all the catastrophic problems that are happening in our society today that are turning things so negatively. And he said, I was quite convinced. They were messages I'd heard a number of times before that I frankly agreed with most of them. He said, then we came over to this class and started to talk, and we find a very kind of a different message about some of the very positive things that are taking place, not only in our country, but throughout the world. I'm going to show you a video that summarizes that. And he said, I just have to tell you, I'm far more compelled by this message. This is something that actually makes me empowered. I feel like I can have a meaningful purpose in not only my own life and the life of my wife and family, but also others around me when I think of things this way. So I would hope that you just for yourself, just take a breath and just see if somehow some of these trends that we're going to talk about might have some kind of an impact also on the way you think or the way you act. What I've got, I apologize, I was going to do that again, but what I've got is a tape that was given by a man that I dearly love. He's a wonderful man, Hans Rosling. Hans Rosling was a man that he just loves statistics. He loves numbers. He's just one of those very euphemistic kind of, very positive, very kind of, help you to understand and to visualize things. He talks about how important it is to not only just tell people numbers, but to give them some kind of, have a visual impact on the way you communicate very important messages. Hans Rosling created a video that I once saw that I was just so taken by. In fact, I saw it one time the night before Education Week, and you should have seen how I scrambled to come up with a copy of that to show the students the next day. I'd like to show it to you. It takes probably a couple of minutes. You'll see that this is the opportunity for an individual who has just brilliantly learned how to put on a screen a very simple message, but I'm going to kind of prepare you for it before you see it. What he's done is this. He's tried to see what's happened in the world since the year 1800. And so he's just saying, since 1800, how has the world progressed over 200 years? Are we doing better with our prosperity? Are we doing worse? And we talk a lot about people that are buried in poverty. How is poverty done in America? Throughout the world. I've seen him in some of his lectures actually ask people beforehand, what's happened to poverty? Has it doubled in the last 200 years? At the people that are they're literally cited as being in poverty, has it stayed about the same, or is it cut in half? And always people reflect and say, no, it's doubled, or maybe it stayed the same. Very rarely do they ever say, well, it's been cut back. I want you to watch this. He's going to give an x-axis and a y-axis. He's going to talk about income, and he's going to talk about longevity. So income and longevity, we call that health and wealth. You know, wealth, the income, and the health of the nations of the world. He's going to show you what's taken place over 200 years. I believe you'll find it very fascinating. I want you to watch carefully. Then once it's done, then we'll summarize what kinds of things I wanted to make sure that you saw during it. So here we go.
First, an axis for health, life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400,000, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubbles show the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up, Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa. And yet,
Despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you just seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
Did you capture the significance of that? I want to go back and I want to reflect on a couple of main things that I wanted to hopefully have you see. The first is this. All he did was, remember we talked about it, he's going to talk about poor and sick down here, and he's going to talk about rich and healthy up here. So here's your lifespan, and there's your income. So lifespan, income, there's your longevity, how long you live. Here's the income, how much income that you're making over that time. Wasn't it fascinating that back in the 1800s, back in 1810, everyone, all the nations were packaged down here at this bottom that we might call poor and sick. Even the United States of America was having significant problems with health at the time and with income that people had. Wasn't it just tremendous how, as he started off and he built, here's 1919, and to see how much progress some of the countries of the world had made. But look at the rest of the countries. Look how fascinating it was that the blues, those in blues and reds and the browns stayed right there. They were buried. They did not make progress. So had we had this exact same conversation back in 1919, you could say, no, they didn't make much progress at all. But then look what took place by 1948. Things started to move. And things started to get, it started to expand so much more. I still think it's very helpful to note, though, where were all those countries, the red, blue, and the browns? They were still buried at the bottom of that chart, even up through 1948. Whew. Now, some of you feel like 1948 was 300 years ago. But just know, just during that very small period of time then, between 1948 and where we are today, look at how much progress those countries, those nations of the world made that were so helplessly buried at the bottom of that chart for so many years. They made great health and made great strides in catching up. And it takes my breath away to hear him say that really, truly, with all the innovations, the technology, the green trade, the technology that he talked about, we really it could become the case that we could all make it to what he called the healthy, wealthy corner as these technologies become ours. I'm going to show you a lot of other quotes. I'm going to show you a lot of other opportunities to just expand for yourself this possibility that when it comes to those things necessary for survival, those things that are necessary to live a comfortable life, I just can't wait to show you the kinds of tools, the kind of resources, and the kind of innovations that are taking place today that could make that possible. So let's look. Let's just kind of go back and take a look real quickly at these things that I'll call compelling trends. Some of them I won't take a lot of time with. Others, I will take some time. I do want to stop. I do want you to see what's taking place and make sure that you capture the significance of it. The first thing that I'm going to talk about is this. We always hate to see an economic reversal. We always hate to see corrections. Most of all, we hate to see recessions and even depressions. But actually, and most people kind of intuitively understand this, it's healthy. It's healthy if the economy can rebound and start back on another path. Why? In the same way, most all of you here have heard that there's something called burning down the forest. Why do you burn down a forest periodically? Because as a forest grows, there's so much undergrowth, there's so many roots, there's so many kinds of things that get mired in the soil around the trees that it literally chokes off the oxygen and the watering resources that they so desperately need to have to survive. So actually, in the most curious way, and so many people have such a hard time understanding this or seeing this, you have to purge that periodically. You have to burn down the forest. When the same way, the same principles affect or it can impact an economy as things get out of control. We've seen it happen. There's a couple of quotes I think you'll like with this. Johann Goethe said, "Everything in the world may be endured except continued prosperity." And we know that even scripturally there's some evidence of this, where we see that, yea, and we see that at the very time when the Lord doth prosper his people, they do harden their hearts, and they do forget the Lord their God, and this because of their ease and their exceeding great prosperity. So Helaman 12 just kind of gives this cycle, the cycle of prosperity that we talk about. And it just says this, that as the Lord blesses us with such great prosperity, then he has to send famines and plagues and pestilences and curses periodically to remind us of who we are and where those resources came from in the beginning. And it actually can be a good, refreshing process to see that happen. So if that's the case, then to have a great recession that we called it back in 2008 can actually be very good. And I'd like to suggest that as the first thing. It could become very helpful to see things like that take place. Now, when we talked about the things that were bad that took place during the recession, we talked about how real estate values plummeted so much. Not only did real estate values plummet, but also interest rates kept getting driven down and down and down. What would that normally lead to? It would lead to the reality that actually real estate, for those who are purchasing real estate after that, became much more affordable. And so as we look at something called the Real Estate Affordability Index, now see if you can catch this. I don't want to spend a lot of time with it, but look at this. So right here, here's the median price of a home. This is back in early about in 1990. Here's the median price. The median means average. That's just one of the kind of three averages that we normally use. But for right now, that just means we took all the homes in America that cost more than that and all the homes that cost less. Where was the actual home, the 50% right there in the middle home, home price? If this is your median home price, and then we took the median or the average income of Americans at that point. Now think about this. See if you can see this. If that's the average home price and that's the average annual income of the family, then real estate at that point would be very what? Unaffordable. What took place after the Great Recession? Look at this. There's that price of the home. There's the average or median price of the home, and there's the average income in America, which suggests to us that the ability for Americans to go out and buy homes was much more reasonable. They could actually afford the home. Now, I will tell you, this was taken back in about 2010 right here. Since that point in time, that gap has closed significantly, but it's still, the Real Estate Affordability Index makes it so that the average income is actually higher than the average cost of a home today. And a lot of that's come because the interest rates have stayed down so low. And you've seen the rebound of real estate in this country. It's not like it just shot back up in value. A lot of places, it's taken quite a lot of time for that price to return. So we hope that there's been some kind of normalcy established or more normalcy established in the way we pay for homes. But the nice thing is that ultimately the real estate is much more affordable today than it was prior to that recession. Next thing I want to talk about is this. So nothing but real estate. That's good. How about corporations? How have they done? How have they fared during that period of time? I want to take you back, and let's assume that we sat in a corporate board of directors meeting in 2005, 3 years before that Great Recession, and somebody brought up the fact they could project forward and they can say, we're going to have the most significant negative economic reversal in this country's history, or at least during our lifetime. Since the Great Depression, we will go through the most significant financial reversal since the Great Depression. It will happen. We will print trillions of dollars. We'll have cataclysmic things taking place with major companies going broke and huge amounts of government infusions that are necessary to get us back out of that. What would you think would happen to the overall strength and financial integrity of corporations in our country? You'd think that for not only then, but for a long period of time, we would suffer quite a bit. Actually, the reverse has been the case. Corporate profits today are actually stronger than they've been in history. I will tell you that I do have a chart coming up here real soon that is actually moderated a little bit, but even still, the corporate profits are very strong and their cash positions are also very strong. And now they're investing in other companies. So from a corporation standpoint, it certainly seems as if they have a lot of confidence in where the future is going. And I've got some numbers up here about what corporate profits were doing in history. I will show you this little chart. This is one that shows corporate profits. Here's back in 1952, where corporate profits were about 6%. But look what's happened to that chart over that period of time, and you can see just how much they've grown. It's very significant. They're much higher than they were. Now this finishes off right here at about 2010. I will show you that there has been some kind of a dip since that point in time, but I will tell you that they're still higher than they have been on the average over that period. So actually, if I'm going to recommend some investments for you at some point in time, what would I recommend? I would surely want to make sure that you're investing in corporations that have good, strong profits. And I'd want to make sure that you also invest in corporations that have good cash positions. They have the good cash on hand to make sure that they can pay their debts. There may never been a better time for that. And I'll show you in our investing class just what kind of significant changes have come about because of that. Never been higher. 75% of reporting corporations beat their earnings estimates. They're holding on to $2.5 trillion in cash right now. The consensus is that there's projected profit growth in each of those corporations. So it's just kind of fun to know that indeed there are some very significant things taking place that people are overlooking when they forget that in 2008, many of the major corporations in America either went bankrupt or I shouldn't say many, but a lot of them did either went bankrupt or they had significant financial reversals. And look what they did with it. I believe that they behaved just brilliantly. So, there's the consumer cash that's back in the market. I won't go into this right now. This is all the cash that's built up in money market funds over that period of time. Now, if it's building up in money market funds, what's happening then? Even though the corporations have done very well, consumers are still quite fearful. Investing in a money market fund is much like burying your money in the ground or something like that, because it's a very extremely conservative way to reflect the fact you're not very positive about the future of the country. Look at how many consumers are still burying their money in the bottom of those money market funds. And even though there's record highs in each of those places, it's just very fascinating. So I did put down the things that are record highs, not just consumer profits and cash positions. Look at this. Consumer cash in bankruptcy in the money market. Corporate cash on hand is at record highs. The per capita net worth of individuals in this country is at record highs. The free cash flow in the country, personal income readings. Can you see how many things? I don't want to get buried in it because it'd take a lot of time talking about each one of them. But look how many things are really, actually, the number of job openings that are taking place in this country. You can see that things are obviously improving very nicely. These are job openings since the year 2000. And you can see that there's a lot of jobs that are waiting for people. And it's pretty strong. It's pretty kind of a nice thing to recognize just how significant all those things can become to us as we reflect on them more positively. In our investment class, we've learned that one of the two most important things you can possibly ever do is to diversify your investments very well and to allocate those investments wisely. We've said that if they're diversified correctly and allocated wisely, history, and there's no guarantee of the future, we know that, but history would suggest to us that will protect the value of the asset during that period of time. How did it do during the Great Recession? There's been some great research. This is the Iverson group that just said this. They argued that asset allocation and diversification are still very valid based upon the drop that took place in 2008 and 2009. They would just suggest this, that it demonstrated that indeed what we've taught you in the investment class, that diversification and allocation is very, so in other words, that became one of what I would refer to as one of the compelling trends that showed us that things are better than what we'd suggest. Let me ask you this question. Some of you have been through economics classes before. You're at least moderately aware of economic principles. In that same meeting that I just talked about we had in 2005, let's just assume that we said this. We said that over the next 5 years, there's going to be a major collapse in the economy. But during that period of time, what the federal government's going to do is one of the answers to our problem is they're going to cut interest rates dramatically. They're going to print a lot of money. You wait till you see how much money they've printed during that period of time or that they've borrowed. So it's money that they did not earn, they did not get in tax revenues. They just either had to borrow it or they had to print it. And I said they would pour nearly $5 trillion, trillion with a T, so hard because billion seems to be more than what I can comprehend. Sometimes 1,000 seems to be more than I can comprehend. But I want you to just kind of think carefully about what it means to have $5 trillion. If I'd have given a good economics class back in 2005 and I said $5 trillion being poured into the economy, what would you naturally say would happen? You'd say, wow, that will just drive inflation and interest rates through the roof because there'll be so much money out there to be lent out. It'll make it so that somehow they can chart, that the interest rates will go way up and inflation rates will go up. What's happened to that? Why is it that interest rates over that period of time and inflation are still at record lows? It's stunning to see how little inflation has gone up. It's actually been quite tame during that period of time, and interest rates have obviously been at the bottom. They've been at the lowest point that they've been in history, and they've just stayed there relatively low. And so there's, once again, here's an article that talks about the same thing. Where's that inflation? The monetary base is ballooned, yet inflation seems far off, or does it? And so this article talks about just the significance of seeing those things stay down. And all I ask you to do is just say, whew, in the middle of all this catastrophic problem, what has happened to those principles that we've kind of taught before in the past, that somehow, boy, if you print that much money, you borrow that much money, and you inject it into the economy, it can cause all sorts of chaos and frustration with inflation and interest rates for whatever reason. The combined federal deficit spending on money, like I just talked about, it's actually, this says $4 trillion. Since we printed this it's gone up to $5 trillion now. So $5 trillion extra dollars have just been printed or borrowed and thrown into the economy during that period of time. That should have had just a terribly detrimental impact on our economy. And for whatever reason, I would call it a compelling trend, it has not. The next section really talks a lot about innovations. We'll talk so much more about it in another class when we talk about the 10 innovations that will change your life the most in the next 10 years. We talk about the 10 medical innovations. We've talked about the 10 technological innovations, the 10 energy innovations. We actually talked about, had the students over the last 2 semesters create the 10 innovations that will change the church the most and allow the church to change the world the most in the next 10 years. It has been very fascinating to see what the students have come up with, and I'll offer that to you as a very fascinating part of this concept of what's taking place in innovations today. I just have to tell you, the greatest minds that look at this and try to sort through it have just said that, linearly, if I took a linear projection of, like in a computer, how often does memory double? How often does RAM speed double? How often does, it could just almost be charted on a linear chart. Linear meaning just very steady, very obvious, very systematic growth. What's happened with most that really do try to understand what's taking place in the world today, they say that chart has just changed. And in many cases, they're just exponential. Exponential in the sense that we can't explain it, we can't describe it, we can't keep track of it. Oftentimes, before we even deliver it to you, what's taking place, what we say has already become part of the past. I like to say this: if there's anything about listening to America's financial future that would make it so that somehow you, in your own mind or in your own path, can begin to project your own personal participation, your awareness of, or your utilization of these great technologies, this would be the one part of our lecture that would be worth all the time that we take. I just hope you sense what it means to understand that this is the age of miracles. Can't wait to talk more about that later. This is the age where we should be watching and just amazed at all the things that are taking place. It is so fascinating to see how lives are being changed, how entire societies are being aided in very significant ways. Wouldn't it be cool? Wouldn't it just be beyond our imagination to just experience for a second this moment when we can see just the kind of things that can significantly change during our lifetime. I always like to say that today's miracle. So if you saw something today that was beyond your imagination, was beyond your ability to describe or to communicate or to somehow factor into your own personal life, if you saw something you could not comprehend or understand, that miracle becomes tomorrow's reality. I'm going to give you an example of that. How many of you could imagine if I'd have had a class like this in 1990, not that long ago, and I'd said something like the internet, and I'd have talked about what can take place on a computer, what kind of things you could download, what kind of access to information you could have, what kind of revolutionary changes that it could create in the world to have access to that tool. I know you, like me, would have just said, it's beyond my imagination, certainly not something that I could ever comprehend, certainly not something that's ever part of my path, because I can't even fathom it, much less help to create what took place. As that did, now come on, for those of you who are there, the first time you ever got on the internet and just clicked that button and watched that screen change and watched information pop up before you in such a dramatic way. It was. I remember sitting there in that chair and just relishing the moment to think that something like that could be possible. Today, when I'm on the internet, all I'm doing is tapping my toe, wondering why it can't go faster. It's just it's a bygone conclusion. If you were born in the last 20 years, you don't even think of it as a miracle. You think of it as just like you and I used to think about telephones when a telephone would make it so that you could communicate with anyone in the world. Wouldn't it be fun, some of these technologies that we'll talk about, to imagine what they'll be as they're assimilated, as they're made possible in behalf of other people? It would be way beyond the scope of this class to take too much time during it. So I'm going to kind of plow through them in a little bit of a kind of a quick way. The first thing we'll talk about those innovations that will take place in medicine. That's one of my favorites, just because I've got a son that's hopeful to go into medicine to contribute to part of this, and I've seen medicine become such an integral part of our lives and integral part of the way that we do what we do, and to see the changes that are taking place today. But I just, in a very quick way, just want to just kind of put down what the students said were the 10 innovations in medicine that will change your life the most in the next 10 years. Certainly we're not going to go into every one of them. Stem cells, nanorobotics, ultrasound surgery, healing people without even having to cut, mapping and diagnosing the DNA human genome. You just imagine what changes it would make in longevity if even stem cells, forget about everything else and just say stem cells, where we have the opportunity to take a cell that you came from in the beginning, and to then just recreate that cell and make that cell become any part of the body or anything that we'd want it to become. It's just one of the most fascinating things we have on scottmarsh.com that we've talked a lot about before. Some of these, in this case, it was 21 days of innovations that will change your life that we recommended back in that time. But each year, the students are asked to recommend the innovations that they feel like will be most significant. For those who'd like to have just a nice, instead of turning on one of those cable news networks that preaches nothing but fear and extreme and disaster, why don't you turn on something that's called TED Talks? I talk about them in my class all the time. TED, T-E-D. If you've never seen them before, it's not a guy. It stands for Technology, Entertainment, and Design. They're workshops where they have the most brilliant people in the world come together, and they give them 18 minutes to communicate their message. What's going on in their life? What's happening in their dreams? Where are they imagining things are taking us? And the neatest thing is they only get 18 minutes to talk about what it is. So they're just very short. But I'll just give you one. Here's one that's on your homework list for tonight. Will you do this? Here's a guy named Daniel Kraft. Daniel Kraft said, "Medicine's future, there's an app for that." Just for fun, go watch that and find out what he says about where medicine is heading. And this one was done like 4 or 5 years ago. And so a lot of the information he's got on there, you'd think, well, we've already got some of it. You'd be stunned. I like to think that when I say the 10 innovations that'll change your life the most in the next 10 years, these are things that are actually happening right now. We have the existing technology. We might need to be ramping it up or doing something with it to make it so that it's available for everyone. But there are things that are really already available. They're very significant, and that's one. So Medicine's Future, there's an app for that. Just go to TED. In fact, what you could do right now is just type in on a Google search. Just type TED Kraft, and it'll come right up, and you'll be able to see that. I think it'll be very helpful for you. Energy efficiencies that are taking place. I talked, as we discussed, the things that should concern us. We talked about our net reliance on foreign oil. Whoa, if I could only show you, and I'll just, for right now, you guys already know that this is the case. Energy, we're just changing that so dramatically. Actually, that's been one of the most dramatic byproducts of what took place during the time between that Great Recession and where we are today. What's taking place and how we're now not so dependent on, and at some point we'll not be dependent at all on foreign oil or foreign energy sources. It is just something that's beyond our imagination how dramatic that can be. Transportation that are taking place in our country. I like to tell people, don't buy cars right now, especially new ones that cost a lot of money. That could just, in the next 5 years, things could change so dramatically. I love to talk about how I in my classes, I'll tell them, I really believe within 5 years, you'll need to have a vehicle to go someplace, and you'll just punch a little button on your smartphone, say, I need a vehicle, and the vehicle will show up at your doorstep, but no one will be driving it, and you'll just jump in and tell it where you want to go, and away it'll go. And you say, it just seems so intergalactic. That seems like that might be 200 years away. They actually have the vehicles that are doing it right now. The only thing that they'll need to do is get people accustomed to the fact that they'll actually be much safer than the ones that you're driving. I like to ask people, like when you're going down the street, what do you want to have coming at you, a driverless vehicle or a teenager texting? It's just, and that's one of the things that will hasten the need for this, is just the reliance that we have on our electronic devices. And when you're going down the street and your phone goes off or your watch vibrates or something like that, how it just distracts you for that little second of time. Oh, I can't wait till they come out. These are driverless vehicles that are actually being made today, and transportation. We obviously don't have a ton of time to talk about it, so for right now, we'll go through education and things that are taking place today. With my students in class, I talk about the types of education and the different levels of education that we are going through. There's a great book written by Clayton Christensen and Henry Eyring Jr. that is now the president of BYU Idaho, on what they call the Innovative University. I just cannot begin to tell you how strongly I feel this. And some people say, but Brother Marsh, aren't you talking yourself out of a job? And I say, yes, I am. We have to get to the point where more education takes place in the way that you're receiving this education right now, in an environment where you don't have to come to a classroom. You can shut off the professor at any time you want to. You can just say, wait a minute, I got to back up. I got to learn that again. I got to make sure that I got that right. There'll be lots of opportunities to turn these into learning outcomes. We just test ourselves with each learning outcome. And instead of feeling like we have to give A, B, C's, and D's, we just have to make sure that individuals that are taking the classes have been able to master each of those outcomes. I cannot begin to tell you. So let me just give you a couple of ideas as it relates to what can take place in this. How many of you heard of the Khan Academy with Solomon Khan? His actual goal is to provide a free world-class education for anyone, anywhere. If you don't know what's taking place, even on his website and what he's done to turn these learning outcomes into opportunities for people to grow and to learn at their own progress and at their own rate of speed, it's just remarkable. Today, there's at least 5 different states. I think there's actually been a couple of them added to that since then that have made it so that a bachelor's degree in their state by one of their state-owned universities cannot cost more than $10,000. Now, that's not in every single type of bachelor's degree, but can you see what they're doing? Instead of these bachelor's degrees where people go into debt by $60,000, $70,000, they're making it so that somehow you can get the total bachelor's degree for at least the tuition that's associated with it just being $10,000. Here's another TED Talk I'd encourage you to listen to. Sugata Mitra, so M-I-T-R-A. He actually was the winner of one of the TED Talks awards at the end of the year, but he talked about building a school in the cloud. So just type in TED Mitra, and his talk will come up, and you'll watch what's taking place and what kind of things can happen. And is it possible? Are there actual people in higher education that are making this happen? Here's a group, Udacity. This was 5 college professors from the Stanford University. Their goal was to reduce the cost of higher education by 90%. They developed enough sophistication and enough new technology that the state of California has actually funded a project where they've taken 400 students, and they're attempting that process right now to see if they can bring that about. These are technologies that are actually available today. I told you earlier, I talk about one of the greatest steps I've seen came from the LDS Church that created that opportunity to receive online programs. It just came out on February 17th of 2017, where they announced that their goal was to make it so that an hour credit, and these are things that you're not just learning the information, you're actually receiving a degree from a university like the Brigham Young University for taking these courses. They're per credit hour. Instead of, my son right now is applying for a master's degree back east, where they're really excited to tell him that per credit hour it's $700. Here's the LDS Church saying the per credit hour would be $67, and in some countries where it's less affordable, they want to get it down to $10. They want to make it so that students can actually learn online. I will tell you this. Just put this on your calendar. Wait 10 years from now and find out what's happening to higher education in our country. This is a trend that is truly one of the most extraordinary things taking place. And actually the access to education, the access to knowledge, the access to learning will be so much more significant and dramatic than it is today. And I believe people's ability to engage the system, we're learning different ways. We're learning different ways of making it so that people will actually progress through the process. It's not perfected itself yet. But I sincerely see the day where higher education will change quite significantly. So there's education. There's some others, so I just quickly put them up there. Information system, wearable supercomputers, and what's that doing? What's that doing to us? I put that under one gigantic category under 23 compelling trends. They're just the extraordinary advances that are taking place in each of those areas. One that we'll simply refer to as world-class prosperity. Well, what's taking place? There's the 10 innovations in the next 10 years. Here's the wealth of great health that there's a whole class on that you can watch. Wireless prosperity that's taking place. The other type of prosperity, We just know that all of those advances will dramatically impact each of those in ways that you'll see. Those are just the classes that we've taught on those areas that we'll make available to you. One of the things that's a compelling trend is this. Research will show us, if any of you have any kind of a degree or an education base in motivation, you know that once somebody's earned a lot of income or a higher level of income, that they more naturally return to that same level of higher income if it's for whatever reason taken away from them for some reason. Does it make sense? If that's the case, do you understand why I would say then the fact that so many people got used to receiving high incomes prior to that Great Recession would make it so that it substantially increases the probability of them returning to that same level of income and creating the economic enterprise that's necessary to return to that same level of income after the recession is over with. And we've indeed seen that become the case. There have been many people who have reestablished those levels of income and have actually, in some cases, increased them since that point in time. That's a nice, positive, compelling trend that is taking place in the country. We've already talked about this, so we will not belabor it a great deal. But we do know this, that the ability for you to live longer and to live healthier has taken a significant increase, and it is growing exponentially. Here's an article that was written about how get used to living past age 100. Here's the Time magazine article that we talked about before that said if you can live to 2045, you'll be immortal. Here's, just look at this, longer life in a pill may already be available to you at a local drugstore. If you go to Singularity Hub, that's a great group out in Nevada that's just the minds and the thought that can go into their products. Just know that your ability to live longer might just come in a pill. And these are very respectable people that are talking about that simple possibility. We could actually live a lot longer and a lot healthier. So remember that. Some people say, I don't want to live a long time. But if you knew you could live healthier, wouldn't that be great? Now, when we get to the wealth of great health class, I'm going to show you some of the quotes that even Brigham Young and Joseph Smith gave about how long we'll live in the last days, and you'll see why it can become a very significant part of a well-planned future. Larger inheritances. Now, this is the good news. The good news is that indeed inheritances will become significant. Over the next 10 years, they say that people in Canada will inherit nearly $1 trillion. They say people in America will inherit nearly $41 trillion. But now, I always say that's the good news. The bad news is this that I tell my students, but your parents are going to live a lot longer. In fact, they're going to live so much longer that it might not be worth ever factoring an inheritance into the financial plan that you're creating for yourself. Can't tell you how many times I've had somebody come to me and say, Brother Marsh, I'd like to see if I'm, if I'm okay financially. And I'll say, great, tell me what your financial assets are. And they say, well, I've got $100,000 here and $200,000 here, but when my father dies, I'll get $5 million. And I always love at that point in time to simply say, now, is there something about your father's life that makes it inevitably close to his demise? Or that somehow he will not live long? Oh, no, I didn't mean it in that way. And I would say, well, is there something kind of morose about planning your father's death into your financial plan? And I don't say that exactly that way. But you can see the point. Whew. So, all right, good inheritances. For those who do have the opportunity to benefit from that, there'll be large inheritances that are passed during the next 10 years. But I always tell my students, don't get used to that thought. In fact, wipe it from your consideration, because there's a chance your parents will live a lot longer, and you're not going to receive that inheritance till a lot further down your life than you ever anticipated before. We talked earlier on about those three legs of the stool. Remember what the three legs of the retirement stool were? The three legs of the retirement stool were your Social Security payments, Social Security, any kind of a pension that you developed where you work, and any kind of money that you can pull out of a 401k. We also shared then that companies are going away from pension plans, and we shared that the contributions to 401k plans have never been lower. That's just catastrophic. I'm going to tell you, though, that there's a way that many people will be filling in that gap. Actually, it will not be quite as catastrophic for some as you might assume. And I'd like to do it through something that I refer to simply as the 2030 pension plan. 2030 means by the year 2030, I'm going to describe for you a pension plan that some people, it will be as common for them to sign up for this as it is to sign up for Social Security, because they'll just need to have it. I don't recommend this for everybody, but for those who really truly do need to have it, then I do recommend it. I think it will become very important for you. It's something that we refer to as a reverse mortgage. Now, some of you have heard of them before. I'm going to give you a very quick overview of them right now. We'll talk more about it when we talk about investments, but for right now, just know this. A reverse mortgage has the following features. It is a loan. It is indeed a mortgage against the house. It's one of the biggest misnomers that's out there when it comes to reverse mortgages. People feel like when you take that out, that means the bank owns your house. When you take any other kind of a mortgage when you're buying your home, does that mean the bank owns your house? No, they just have a lien against your house or a trust deed against your house. Same thing is the case here. They just have a lien or a trust deed. When you pass away or you sell your house or whatever, then all that you have to do is repay that loan and everything's just fine. You still own the home. It is payments for life. It can be set up that way. I'd highly encourage anybody doing this to make it so that it's payments for life. Unfortunately, 62% of all reverse mortgages taken out in America today, people are taking out a lump sum, and guess what they're doing it? They're taking it and investing it in some whack-a-lack investment that some knuckle-headed financial advisor said will so outpace anything that, oh, please don't do that. The federal government's trying to tell everybody the exact same thing. Every consumer group is telling people the exact same thing. Just don't bet your home on some nonsensical investment that unfortunately many people have gotten themselves in a real pickle because of that. So hopefully you'll accept payments for life. Those payments that you receive are completely income tax free because they're treated for tax purposes as borrowed money. They're repaid. You only have to repay this loan at your death, when you sell the home, or when you move out of the home. That's kind of cool. Now think about it. That's kind of important for you to internalize that. When you die, or you sell the home, or you move out of the home, there's a lot of people that are senior citizens living in homes today that they'll live in until they die. And in many cases, 75% of all people that reach age 65 in our country, in our country today that own a home, actually, ever bought a home, now own that home. 75% of them. That means a ton of people are sitting on this huge block of equity, this huge block, this financial asset, that if we can turn that into a way to receive payments during your lifetime, it is pretty darn cool. Those payments are backed completely by the federal government. When I say they're tax-free, they'll continue to be paid throughout the rest of your life. When you do need to have that as a supplement to your Social Security. So maybe your three-pronged stool is not as strong as you'd like it to be, you might place a reverse mortgage in as one of those prongs or one of those legs in your stool. Actually, by the year 2030, it will become extremely common because so many people have planned so poorly for their eventual demise, and it'll just make it so that they'll have to have something like that in order to survive. And although that's a little unfortunate, we'll take that. Something that happens at the bottom of these recessions, and it took place at the bottom of this recession too, is something called the government bailout. The government frequently will step in and they'll take certain businesses or certain municipal governments or something, and they'll say, that business or that municipal government is too big to fail. Too big. We can't let that fail. If we let that entity fail, then it would have a catastrophic financial impact on the overall economy. So they'll step in and bail them out. Many people have grown very weary of that. They don't believe that that's the right thing to do. If you asked right now, how many of the bailouts that have ever taken place in the United States history actually became a positive story, I think you'll be refreshed. It will be refreshing for you to know that actually government bailouts have worked quite well. Now, I'm not arguing for them. I don't want you to think that for a second that I'm saying that they should become a standard part of everything that we do. But can you just see that as a compelling trend, that as those have taken place and people became so fearful of all the horrible things that could happen with them, it's actually been a pretty good success. You can validate this by going to ProPublica. It's a journalism for the public interest. They'll first of all give you a history of all the United States government bailouts that have ever taken place. Then they'll actually go back and say, what was the aftermath? Did they really pay it back? Did it become a positive story? And actually, some of you are not going to want to hear this, but actually every single one of them became a positive story, except one. They do say that in the government bailout of 2008, the money they gave to the automakers had never been repaid, or never been enough of that repaid. And so that was one that did not get repaid. But all the other TARP money and everything else that they gave, I'll just show you a couple of interesting quotes. Here's Robert Bennett, who was a senator from the state of Utah, just recently passed away. But Robert Bennett was when he was back there in the Senate, had a lot to do with the Treasury and a lot to do with treasure, in the United States Senate. And he just said this. He said, but AIG, that was American Insurance Group, has come through, finally paying back all of the TARP money it received, plus $17 billion in interest. Here's the key sentence. So he said, if we exclude the money given to the auto industry, remember that's the guys that didn't pay back, all the TARP money has been paid back. It's been a moneymaker for the government. It's a story with a happier ending than even I anticipated. So I remember, I'm not arguing for bailouts, but I am saying if we're going to look for things that are actual positive outgrowths you need to be aware of, certainly the government bailouts that have taken place deserve to be included on that list. I'm going to cover this next one real quickly, so just see if you can visualize this. Throughout time, there's been all sorts of situations where there's lots of new entrants into our workforce. So we just say this. Whenever we have a workforce assimilation, so new entrants into the workforce, think of how many of them there have been. You know, when we turn from an agrarian society and even to an industrial side, manufacturing, services to income, think about computer displacement. How many of you were alive back in the 1990s when computers were really taking off? And people just projected that within 10 years, there'd be no jobs left, that computers would just do everything. Isn't it amazing that over that period of time, even though computers have obviously just flourished and they've become a much more dynamic part of our life, why is it that our workforce has been able to assimilate that so well? There were a lot of people at the bottom of that 2008 recession that just said this: there's no way we're going to be able, there's the 2008 Great Recession right there, all the immigrants that have come to our country. When there were two-income families, suddenly we decided that two adults in the family making money would be better than one. And there's so many others that entered the workforce. We just thought that would be the death of the workforce. What has taken place since that time? There's 2006. There's what happened to unemployment during that period of time. Look what's happened. Every single trend since then has been downward in unemployment. We've assimilated people, even in the worst of economies. Now, some would argue, I get the point, that maybe they've not created the kind of jobs that you'd like to see them create. But I'll just say this. People are working. It seems as if, and there's great projections that would suggest as new technologies become available, instead of always replacing people, it actually creates a lot of new opportunities for those who understand those technologies, engage the technologies, innovate new opportunities for creating employment as it relates to those technologies. It's a wonderful thing to just see how well workplace assimilation has taken place in our country. Something kind of a little closely related to it is something that we refer to as demographics. Demographics, people. What kind of a position are we in as a country today if you just knew this? Now think about this just for a second, because this is an important, very important kind of an educational rendezvous, a transformation point that you want to understand. What actually makes it so that the economy works? It's people spending money, or corporations spending money, or government entities spending money. Anyone who's analyzed it will say the overwhelming stimulant of all growth is individuals spending money. We call those individuals markets. A market. Isn't it fascinating how well people make markets? So let's say it's an immigrant to this country. That immigrant comes here and they work hard and they make money and they make money. They're very resourceful. We found that immigrants are generally, overall, there are obvious exceptions, but overall they're resourceful, they're hardworking, they'll sacrifice, they live fairly. They'll work at jobs that a lot of people would refuse to work at. And so as they come here and they are resourceful, and as they do, guess what they do with the money? They also need to live, don't they? They need to survive. So what do? They go out and spend some of their money. So they become a market itself. How is American demographics today? I need to give you this quite quickly because I can't really take too much time on it, but I'm going to show you three different books that I'd like to suggest to you, or two different books and an entity. Here's America by Joel Kotkin in 2050 and what he says. Here's Peter Diamandis and Stephen Kotler with the book Bold. And here's a group that actually invests in ways that capitalize on the demographics of this country. Let's see if we can take them real quickly. All I'll say this as we do this is new people create healthy new markets. How will those healthy new markets be created? Here's our American demographics. Let me just show you this. In the book, America by the year 2050, he projects that there'll be 100 million new workers by the year 2050. And here's one of the quotes that was in the book. He simply said this: the America of 2050 will evolve into one of the truly transcendent superpowers in terms of society, technology, and culture. He said, among advanced countries, America will emerge by mid-century as the most affluent, culturally rich, and successful nation in human history. By one author, kind of a traditionally more liberal guy. A lot of people were very upset at him as he said those things. But what he's saying is this: is the demographics, the way that the demographics that we have, because we have the highest birth rates of any industrialized nation. In fact, we have the only positive birth rate of any industrialized nation because immigration is in this country. He literally, because of those two new demographic trends, or those existing strength of those demographic trends, made those very bold predictions about where America would be by 2050. Would you imagine that? There's one author in just one of the 23 compelling trends that we're talking about that projected, because of demographics in this country, you'd have all those wonderful new workers. There are others who have said very critical things. In this book, Bold, by Stephen Kotler and Peter Diamandis, it's just remarkable. Now catch this. So this is not just talking about the American economy. Look what they say. They say between the years 2016 and 2020, the rising billion, that's what they call it, the rising billions, 3 to 5 billion new consumers who have never purchased anything, never uploaded anything, and never invented and sold anything are about to come online and provide a mega surge to the global economy. What's that talking about? You know, my wife and I did a humanitarian project in Cambodia where we built homes for people. And I remember as we went there, we met people. As we drove into their village, we met people that literally had been on programs where they had lived in hovels and lean-tos. Many call Cambodia one of the poorest of poor countries. They'd lived in absolute abject, poverty. And they'd been tutored and helped and mentored, and they'd grown, and they'd come to the point where it was time to now reward them at the end of their program by having a home. And they had to buy the plot for the home, but then other individuals would pay for these homes. Now, when I say homes, they're kind of like, they're tough sheds on stilts. But to them, that's a very, very nice home in Cambodia. We'd pull into these villages, and here are these people that had lived in abject poverty, and we'd start helping them build these homes, and it's just a great surprise that, like right in the middle of it, you'd hear a cell phone ring, and one of these people that had been in abject poverty would pull a cell phone out of their pocket and start talking on it. Ugh. Do you know what access we have to communication today that we never had before? We'll show it in another lecture that we talk about. I think right now they say that 75%, it's close to 75% of all adults in the world currently have cell phone access. 75%. They project that within 10 years, that many people, that many adults throughout the world will have access to smartphones, which means they have the access to not only the ability to talk to others and to receive information, but to also have access to the world of the wealth of knowledge that we're talking about. With that new knowledge and with that new access, they become what? They become new consumers that they've never been before, driving this, what these authors suggested was a mega surge in the global economy during that period of time. So these, now watch, so the ones we talked about first was because of high birth rates and because of immigration. These guys are talking about all the new consumers that are coming online today throughout the world that have never been there before. The last one we'll talk about is just demographics, this group called demogranomics. And they just did this. For those who know anything about the stock market, they'll know that after the baby boomers, you've all heard of what a baby boomer is. As the baby boomers came online, as people returned from the Second World War, they started having children, there was this massive growth of individuals that could buy new things. And as they bought new things, that created markets. And what happened to the stock market during the period of time when so many people were buying new things? Well, it just created wonderful growth in the stock market. What these guys are suggesting is that the next 10 years to 20 years are filled with this new market that is even actually much larger than that baby boomer market. They're called the millennials. They're coming online now. They're making it so that they'll be purchasing things. They're trying to reflect what would happen if somebody did, in their investment portfolio, capitalized on the things that they're most likely to be shopping for. So here's the baby boomers. There are 78.2 million of them. Generation X, which was kind of between the baby boomers and the millennials, they only had 69 million people. But look at the millennials, 86 million people that are now investing and putting things into and buying things that were never there before. So I wanted to kind of make sure you saw just this. Make sure you see that the book that we talked about with Joel Kotkin just based it all on high birth rates and immigration. The Rising Billion by Peter Diamandis based on all these new billions of people that we've been buying it because they have new access to from their smartphones. And this is creating those new consumer dynamics or demographics that come from millennials. So each of those talking about a demographic group that is particularly positioned today to capitalize on a huge surge of prosperity because of being here in America and being able to do it. We would just say that all those things rise to make it so that, and this is, I'll give you the quote just because in the past, I've always felt it was important for myself. The United States still has many competitive advantages. Among them is its large, expanding, and comparatively youthful population. Unlike some rich countries, America isn't suffering from a shrinking workforce. It continues to attract the best and the brightest from all over, many to America's best universities, which remain unrivaled. That came out of the Los Angeles Times. So you can kind of quickly see why the demographics of this country really are well positioned to make it so that the prosperity associated will be very significant. I'm going to go through 2 or 3 quite quickly. America has always been acknowledged for their creativity, their imagination, their resourcefulness, and their insight and their insightfulness. Fortunately, that has come with the recognition and the knowledge that it still is well alive. There are many who are writing about it today. I wish I could put some of those up here, but I just felt like it was beyond the scope of our class. It seems as if all those things are alive and well, and they're a very important dynamic of what we'd call our compelling trends. What's something else? We have a good higher education and skilled workforce. Our education and skilled workforce is just as bright and as good as it's ever been. I love this. I one time heard a guy give a research report that he'd done on people that had won gold medal or won some medal at the Olympics. And he just asked this question: no matter what country they came from, where did they all train? And they basically said this: although America wins a certain amount of gold medals or silver medals or whatever, if you took everyone that actually did their training to prepare for their medal at an American university or some kind of an American facility, you would be stunned at how much we're still relied on as that country that has that kind of strength and has the education base that's necessary to make it so that so many people still come here. Our education base is still extraordinary. We talked in the first thing about likely new taxes, or the fact that taxes will go up. I do believe that likely that there will be new taxes, but I'll just right now, and it's a very cursory way, suggest that the new tax could come from sales taxes, consumption taxes, value-added taxes, transaction taxes. I'd love to talk about I have my students go home and do a little research on what a transaction tax is and the difference that it could make in our country if we could ever convert to something like that and make it I wish I could go into some depth to talk about what kind of benefits would be derived from it, but just know this, that although there will be new taxes, I do not believe will be quite as punishing as we've assumed that they will be, as we've talked about what kind of an impact they could have on it. Over time, if we look historically, let's look historically for just a second and ask ourselves this question: how has America recovered from significant financial collapses or problems or economic reversals or whatever? We would say that the American economy, historically, now remember, we always have to throw that word historically on it. We don't know what will happen in the future. But if indeed the future can in any way be predicted based upon the consistency of the past, we would just suggest this, that the American economy ultimately has to grow. There was a great book that was written at the bottom of the recession by a guy that was somewhat liberal, and he was criticized heavily for writing this. The guy's name was Stephen Rose. He wrote the book called Rebound. I would highly recommend that anyone who wants to see the progress that we've made pick up that book. He gave what at the time were seen as some fairly controversial reflections on what he felt like America would do over the next 10 years because we simply had to grow. It seemed to many people at the time to be unbelievable to think that that could take place. Isn't it remarkable? If you go back and you go through, and I wish I could give you a big list of the things that he projected, so many of the things that he projected would take place that at the time seemed so unbelievable have now actually taken place. We really have rebounded quite well, and we believe, based upon history, that there's a solid possibility or probability that we'll continue to do that. The next is kind of really closely related to it. We continue to be the world leader in so many different areas. I just have to kind of, here's a thing from Time Magazine that talks about all the things that we're still world leaders in. And I think I've got another screen up here. Yeah, I wanted to kind of show you some of the things. The United States economy is the largest and the most productive in the world. It leads the world in manufacturing goods. It's among the largest exporters. It is still loved by foreign investors. It has top global brands. It is the world leader in technology, the world's best. Do you see what I'm saying? Do you know how long that list could go when it comes? This is the U.S. Trust Bank that created that list. And they just said, if you want to just kind of experience for yourself a little simple reflection and not get too buried in the fear and the hopelessness that comes from a recession and from cable news networks, you just might want to consider some of the things that you'll never hear on the news, things that are really still very impressive about what America has done, about where America is, and what it can still accomplish because of all the things that we've done. I, for one, believe that indeed the financial regulations that came as a result of 2008 were for the most part very helpful. And I would like to just add to it when it comes to compelling trends, I do believe that the financial markets can get out of control. They can become out of perspective. They do need to have some kind of, and people will debate endlessly what kind of regulation they actually need. Can we really just truly let them flow and have no regulations at all, or are some regulations necessary? I, for one, believe that the new regulations that came because the passage of all these financial reforms will make us safer at a reasonable cost. And I really do agree that that is the case. When we talk about how well businesses perform, back in number 3, remember, we talked about corporate profits and cash strong. How did municipal governments do? When that economy collapsed, there was a gal named Meredith Whitney. She was just recognized at the time as one of the most brilliant people in the country as it related to municipal debt. What's municipal governments? For those of you who don't know, a municipal government is any government in the United States of America that is not the federal government. So the state of Utah, the state of California, the state of Texas, the county of Utah County, the county of Tuscaloosa County, the counties, whatever, or cities in each of those entities. How did those municipal governments fare during that period of time? Meredith Whitney went on 60 Minutes in an interview in 2010, predicted that all of the problems that have been created will amount to hundreds of billions of dollars worth of municipal bond defaults. Very controversial at the time, but a lot of people really believed that what she said was correct. What has actually happened with municipal government since then? Actually, the rates of municipal government defaults in 2010 decreased by over 8.6%, and since that time have continued to decrease. I always tell my students, if you know a mayor or a county councilman or something like that, put your arms around them and tell them how much you appreciate them. For some reason, now I'm not telling you that still there couldn't be some problems, but with all the predictions by those who were considered to be the ultimate experts in what was taking place in municipal bonds, can I simply suggest this? Municipal governments, I believe, financially, performed with nearly the same brilliance as corporations. It has actually been a remarkable trend to see just how stable they are and how remarkable they were during that period of time. We already talked about this, so I'm not going to do it for a long time. Energy independence, what's happened, with energy within 4 years. There it is right there. The United States could be energy independent within 4 years by CNN Money. That was in 2015, they said that. And this is a little chart that shows how we're moving towards energy independence. I just shut off the machine for 2 seconds and just pause and simply reflect on the difference 10 years has made when it comes to what we were 10 years ago and what we are now as it relates to our ability to sustain ourselves with our own energy and not have to rely on anyone else for that energy, and what's happening in green energy and technologies. And I just see a very bright future, and I see some possibilities that I think are very hopeful and in my mind certainly qualifies as one of what we'll refer to as those compelling trends. I've talked with you about this simple thing called world-class prosperity. Now, world-class prosperity you saw with Hans Rosling in his tape just give you some indication of what's taking place in this area of what we call world-class prosperity. Let me give you a couple of quotes that I just always loved. You see if somehow you don't appreciate what's being said. Here's that book that we've discussed called Abundance. The Future is Better Than You Think. It's by Peter Diamandis and Stephen Kotler. In that book, Abundance, now listen, it's been out there for long enough now, you could buy it for 50 cents on Amazon.com. I'd highly recommend any of you purchase it. Even though it's been out there for a while, it's been updated since the time it was written, and the insights, the observations of innovations that are taking place inside of a book like this. I found myself, as I read that book, even though I teach this class, I'm constantly looking at the innovations that are taking place. I'm constantly having the students take a look at them. As I read that book, I just found myself just eye-popping type results that were taking place in the world today. But listen to these two paragraphs from the book that I particularly like. They just said this. Now, come on, carefully consider this. I'll even slow down a little bit, although that's nearly impossible for me. I'll slow down to make sure that you hear all of it. They said this: within one generation, we'll be able to provide goods and services once reserved for the wealthy few to any and all who need them. Well, goods and services, once reserved for only the wealthiest of wealthy, will be providing to any and all who need them. Here's the second paragraph. They said, imagine a world of 9 billion, that's about how many we have on the world today. Imagine a world of 9 billion people with clean water, nutritious food, affordable housing, personalized education, top-tier medical care, and non-polluting ubiquitous energy. We should read it again. It is so worth imagining that somehow anything that we're talking about could actually accelerate as it relates to world-class prosperity. You consider for yourself. You go read it for yourself. You read something about it. You don't actually have to read it. You could type in Peter Diamandis, Diamandis. You type that into a TED Talk, and he actually gives much of the same kind of information at his TED Talks. I think you'll find that it's nearly breathless to imagine that indeed we could, within one generation, he's calling a generation 15 to 20 years. He said within 15 to 20 years, all of those things will be available to people, and the prosperity. We'll talk about what the brethren have said about prosperity and the kind of problems that prosperity will create for us by the time we get to the end of it. It's just remarkable. Here's another book that's written about basically the same thing, The Rational Optimist, that was written by Matt Ridley. They talked about how prosperity evolves. I'm not going to go into all that. Here's the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that talk about what they're accomplishing with Warren Buffett and others. I would just hope that somehow you kind of get involved enough to see and sense in some kind of a more personal way the realities of what's taking place so that you too can be involved and be part of that. Whenever we talk about what can take place in the world or what we talk about a compelling trend, I always love to, with my class, talk about why the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints has strengths that are truly unique. I once wrote a little thing for my sons. It was around Christmas time, and I wanted to show them the 12 gifts of Christmas that maybe the Savior brought to their lives and that were unique and exclusive to the theology that we have. As I did that, I got a little out of control, and I ended up with 58 of them. And I'm not saying that's an exhaustive list. I just say that they're the ones that I came up with. Can I just, from that list, pick off things that might clearly relate to something a little more financial or economic, something that kind of, as we look at what's taking place in the world with world-class prosperity, can we also take a look at what's taking place in a church that truly has strengths that are remarkable, that are exclusive in many instances you don't find other places? Think of the welfare system of the church today and the kind of benefits and the resources that it provides to people to provide them a source of inspiration and a source of financial substance that you simply do not see in other areas. We're a very highly educated group. Per capita, we're probably the most highly educated group in the world. We're multilingual. I love it, BYU. I'll always say to my class, I'll say, okay, how many? I usually have about 300 people in my class there, in my student class, and I'll say, how many of you know a second language, can speak 2 languages? Probably 2/3 of the class raise their hands. Now, where else in the world can you go and have that access to people who actually can begin to communicate in a very prosperous way with the nations of the earth? I just think that's so remarkable. We're a very highly organized group. I love to talk about one thing. I'll tell you about it right now because I think it's important. Ted Koppel, who was a very sophisticated journalist, a very renowned and very honored journalist in our country's history. For those of you who are anything over the age of 40, you probably know the name Ted Koppel very well. He was nevertheless, he was doing a research project on something that he called the catastrophe, the potential catastrophe that was being set up in our electronic grid throughout the country. And he wanted to write a book, and he called he wanted in this book to identify or to call out organizations or institutions that he felt like were better prepared. And so as he's writing his book, it's called Lights Out, for those who'd like to get a copy. It's a great book. And when he was preparing his book, someone told him how well the Mormons were prepared and how well they are prepared and organized to take care of their people. I love it when somebody says, I don't know if I like organized religion. And I love to say, whew, it's organization that brings all these extraordinary benefits to you. But nevertheless, so Ted Koppel said he understood the Mormons were quite well prepared. And in Ted Koppel's own words, he said, well, geez, I thought for myself, who do I know that's a Mormon? So he thought, well, I know Orrin Hatch is a Mormon, so he called Orrin Hatch. He said, I understand you're well prepared. I'd like to learn more about it. And Orrin Hatch said, I'd love to tell you more about it, but there's someone better positioned to do that. His name's Henry Eyring. You need to go to Ted Koppel, for whatever reason, didn't know Henry Eyring in the presidency of the church, and so he made contact with Henry Eyring. And he said, I understand you're very well prepared. I'd like to have you tell me something more about the preparation of the Mormon church. And in Ted Koppel's own words, he said, Henry Eyring said, I'd love to do that, but you have to come to Salt Lake City. I won't tell you over the phone. Ted Koppel said, oh, you have to understand something. I got some publishing deadlines. I have to hurry with this. I really would prefer it if we could just do it over the phone. Henry Eyring said, I just won't do it. You have to come to Salt Lake. So Ted Koppel quite reluctantly booked his trip. He came to Salt Lake. When he got here, he looked at Henry Eyring and he said, like President Eyring said, you know, I've got about 3 hours, you know, and Henry Eyring said, I can't tell you. That's not enough time. No, you just got to, you have to understand my publishing deadline. Nope, you got to give me more time than that. I will not be able to describe everything to you in that period of time. Trust him, President Eyring, he's so good. Anyway, you know, Ted Koppel reluctantly said, okay, well, where did President Eyring, Elder Eyring take him first? He took him out to the distribution center, that new Bishop storehouse out there. There's probably 5 or 6 football fields full of nothing but resources that are available in the time of crisis or an emergency. He started there. Then it started to take him to the different places that showed just how well prepared we are. Instead of just spending 3 hours in Salt Lake City, Ted Koppel spent 3 days in Salt Lake City. When he wrote his book, he dedicated 3 chapters of the book to the organizational of the LDS Church and said this. He said, no one is better prepared and better organized to care for the needs of their people. Can you imagine that? In a world where we're looking for prosperity, you know, signs of prosperity, signs for our ability to provide for and care for the needs of individuals. Here's Ted Koppel, truly a remarkable man, a remarkable, renowned journalist who stood and took the time, wrote 3 chapters about it, and said they're the most organized entity on the earth when it comes to caring for the needs of their people. Can you see why that's a strength of this theology of this church that's helped so much? We're missionary discipline. We're sick. I have 5 sons that serve missions. We'll soon have a bit of a missionary opportunity for ourselves, and I'm just overwhelmed to think of what it means to have a church that is so well positioned with all the missionaries that they put out in the field and all the training that those missionaries go through. It's remarkable. We're financially strong. The seminary training that take place on a regular basis, our international presence. It just goes without saying that our perpetual education fund. We should add to this now the Pathways of Education Fund. We should add to it a number. I'll tell you another one that came out real recently was just our self-sufficiency course that you can now take. That's part of a program throughout the church to make sure that people really do have the tools for self-sufficiency. Does that, or is that compelling on any level to you when you think of the compelling trends that make our country and make our society, in this case, as members of the church, so rewarding and so well prepared to deal with all those things that could take place in the future? With that, I wanted to share with you a couple of quotes. We're drawing to the end of this. I think it's particularly helpful. We've had some prophetic quotes that I quite like, that have helped us to put things in perspective. Put things in perspective in particular times of difficulty or challenge. For those of you who do still seem to feel like there's just an overwhelming sense of fear, an overwhelming sense of destruction or gloom or problems, I want you to consider the words of the prophets. We had a wonderful prophet by the name of Howard W. Hunter who spoke at BYU in 1993. Some are not old enough to really remember what was taking place in 1993, but there have been some very significant economic reversals at that point in time. Here's Elder Hunter speaking to a group of students at BYU. And now this is a long quote, so I want to warn you in advance, it's a long quote. And you're not supposed to put long quotes on PowerPoint presentations. But I hope that you, by the time I get to the end of it, will see why I don't know that I could shorten this quote and give it the justice that it needed to. So let's just read it real fast. I'm here tonight. Just remember, this is Howard W. Hunter speaking to the students at the Brigham Young University. I'm here tonight to tell you that despair, doom, and discouragement are not an acceptable view of life for a Latter-day Saint. However high on the charts they are on the hit parade of contemporary news, we must not walk on our lower lip every time a few difficult moments happen to confront us. I'm just a couple of years older than most of you. He was had a great sense of humor. He was probably 95 by the time, and he's talking to this group of students. I'm just a couple of years older than most of you. And in those few extra months, I have seen a bit more of life than you have. I want you to know that there have always been some difficulties in mortal life, and there always will be. But knowing what we know and living as we're supposed to live, there really is no place, no excuse for pessimism and despair. In my lifetime, I've seen 2 world wars. Now, let me just pause. Most watching this have never lived through a world war. You think that times might be tough now. You might think there's fears. You might think that there's destruction taking place. You might think that the negative signs of the times are just overwhelming. Let me just suggest to you this. You go through a world war. You go through the despair that took place when those people had to literally think that the end of time had arrived on their doorstep. There'd be no way to solve the problems. There were too many superpowers. There were too many people that literally had too many conflicting opinions about the way things should be. It was a terrible time. Here's a man who lived through 2 world wars, plus Korea, plus Vietnam, and all that you're currently witnessing. I've worked my way through a depression. He was there, and managed to go to law school while starting a young family at the same time. I've seen stock markets and world economies go crazy. I've seen a few despots and tyrants go crazy, all of which causes quite a bit of trouble around the world in process. But now here's my paragraph. Just kind of take a deep breath. We're going to kind of slow down a little bit and make sure that you capture all of this. So I'm frank to say tonight that I hope you won't believe that all the world's difficulties have been wedged into your decade, or that things have never been worse than they are for you personally, or that they will never get better. If I have to wake you up for anything, here's what it is. I want you to hear this next sentence very carefully. I reassure you that things have been worse and that they will always get better. They always do, especially when we live and love the gospel of Jesus Christ and give it a chance to flourish in our lives. What great hope. Here's another one, a modern prophet today that lives. I just had an opportunity to meet with Elder Ballard not long ago, and I talked about this quote, and I talked about why it was so significant. And I reflected on what it had meant to me and to my students to have this quote. Elder Ballard, in speaking to the Brigham Young University, Idaho commencement address in 2012, said this to the students. Now, I'm going to preface it with this. I'm not going to show you the part of the quote where he said this, but in the middle of his talk, he said this. I conscientiously sought my Heavenly Father's Spirit to know which message he most wanted you to hear. Of all the potential messages he could have given, he said, which one do you most want to hear? And I reflected that day as I met with him, what it meant to know that a prophet of God, someone as renowned and as experienced as Elder Ballard was, to say something like that, and then to say, this is what he wanted you to hear. He said, face the future with optimism. I believe that we're standing on the threshold of a new era of growth, prosperity, and abundance. Barring a calamity or unexpected international crisis, I think the next few years will bring a resurgence in the economy as new discoveries are made in communication, medicine, energy, transportation, physics, computer technology, and other fields of endeavors. Remember the 10 innovations will change your world the most? Oh, can you imagine someone saying, I see a future. I think we're standing on the threshold of a new era of growth, prosperity, and abundance. I so enjoy, I so appreciate the fact that so many of the brothers seem as if they're delivering to us a message which often gets buried in everything else we see and hear. Elder Packer, just two general conferences before he passed away, simply said this, nevertheless, when I think about the future, I'm overwhelmed with feelings of positive optimism. We're missing those things. I believe that we have compelling historical momentum that we have right now. We have the brilliance of an eternal mindset. We have a surprisingly prosperous future that we can look forward to if we see it correctly. There's one more that I want to share with you that will actually, this is Elder Holland, and I want you, as you see this, to listen very carefully. I'll try to emphasize when we come back to it what it is that he said and what it is that was so important for him to understand when it is someone looking and saying, what's out there, what can take place, what might take place, how can I view this, and what's my responsibilities, my opportunities as a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints to experience some of these tremendous successes that we see.
I have just two things to say to any of you who are troubled about the future. I say it lovingly and from my heart. First, we must never in any age or circumstance let fear and the father of fear, Satan himself, divert us from faith and faithful living. There have always been questions about the future. Every young person, every young couple in every era has had to walk by faith into what has always been some uncertainty, starting with Adam and Eve in those first tremulous steps out of the Garden of Eden. But that's all right. That's the plan. It will be okay. Just be faithful. God is in charge. He knows your name. He knows your need. Faith in the Lord Jesus Christ. That is the first principle of the gospel. And it says in President Daly's hymn, commemorating our pioneers of the past, faith in every footstep. But like those pioneers, you do have to keep taking them. One step, and then another, and then the next. That's how tasks are accomplished. That's how goals are achieved. That's how frontiers are conquered. In more divine language, that is how worlds are created. And it's how your world will be created. God expects you to have enough faith and determination, enough trust in Him to keep moving, keep living, keep rejoicing. In fact, He expects you not simply to face the future. That sounds pretty grim and stoic. He expects you to embrace it and shape it, to love it and rejoice in it and delight in your opportunities. God is anxiously waiting for the chance to answer your prayers and fulfill your dreams, just as He always has. But He can't if you don't pray, and He can't if you don't dream. In short, He can't if you don't believe.
So did you hear them all? I just want to summarize a few of them. There have always been questions about the future. That's the plan. Oh. he reflected on it. He said, as Adam and Eve left the Garden of Eden, do you think they had questions about the future? Do you think they might have some trepidation about what would happen to them or what could take place? What was their mindset? What was their motivational source of strength at that point in time? That's the plan. There's always been questions about the future. He said, just take one step and then another and then the next. That is how the worlds are created. Whew. What a great quote. And here's my favorite part of it. I mean, although I love all of it, here's the favorite part is embrace the future, to shape it, learn to shape it, to love it, and to rejoice in it, to delight in your opportunities. God is anxiously awaiting to answer your prayers and to fulfill your dreams. I will just suggest to you that there's reason to believe in who we are. There's reason to believe that we are indeed children of light. There will be those who are fearful in the last days. I can't wait with you in our investment lecture to share with you what happened in Luke 17, where the nobleman left the vineyard, and when he came back, he asked what they'd done with the money the servants, what they'd done with their resources. I'll only summarize it in one word. The multipliers were rewarded greatly. The person who feared and who buried their money or buried the talent had it taken away from him. Imagine the possibility. I just suggest this, that as we see America's financial future, as we say our opportunities, not only as those who are graduating from high schools or universities, but those who are the best and the brightest people that would ever take a course like this, would ever take the time to go through this process. I want you to experience with me as I reflect in gratitude about you and about all the things that you mean to us as you can see things so optimistically. One of the things that Elder Hunter shared in that same talk that we talked about right there was just this. I thought it was so good. He said, many of the prophets of the past saw our day. So if you take of Isaiah and how he saw our day, or you take the prophet Nephi and how he saw, and Lehi, how they saw our day, he said, and each of them, as they saw our day, rejoiced. What would make them so happy? if all the doom, despair, and destruction that people somehow see and sense and seem so impacted by was ultimately the reality that we'll experience, would those prophets be rejoicing? They saw our day and they rejoiced. I love to laugh with the students and I say, can you imagine Isaiah seeing a smartphone in his vision years and years ago? I'm thinking that people, literally 75% of all adults on the world, will have access to the world's knowledge on a device that they can just look and type in a Google search or in some way try to figure out what it is that they'd like to understand and know more about. Can you imagine that? Can you see why he rejoiced? Can you go through any of those things that we talked about as compelling trends and think of those prophets seeing any of those compelling trends and saying, wow, that's why our Heavenly Father wants to send the best and the brightest, so indeed they can make all those things available to those who, for whatever reason, can only see the doom and despair and destruction. It's my witness that as you see the light, as you see the future, as you allow yourself to become one of those who become captivated by the insights, by the technologies, by the innovations, by the economic cycles that are truly here to bless our lives, indeed you'll become an important part of what I perceive to be a very positive future for everyone. And I share all of that with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.